Pay rent or get out. The words cracked the stale hospital air before the sting hit my cheek, and the room tilted. I tasted metal, felt the IV tug, and caught myself on the cold tile with one hand. The monitor squawked and then steadied while he turned and walked out like nothing had happened. I lay there, breath caught under my ribs, certain of one thing: this time I wasn't staying down. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to stand up for yourself when it cost you comfort, hit that like and subscribe, so this story finds the people who need it. My name is Morgan, and I was raised on small-town rules that sounded simple: keep your word, keep your head down, and take care of your own. Mom kept a jar for spare change on the kitchen counter, and Dad kept a list on the fridge of what we owed, even if it was just gas money or half a water bill. The line between love and ledger was faint, but always there. I worked my way through nursing school, pouring coffee at night and studying between shifts, and when Ellie came along, I learned how to stretch ground beef into 3 dinners and how to sleep sitting up in a plastic ER chair. We lived in a 1-bedroom apartment with thin walls and a faithful leaky faucet, and I didn't complain because I had steady hours at a community clinic and a little girl who laughed in her sleep. Then March rolled in, gray and heavy, and my schedule was cut in half with a budget memo that said, temporary like that word could pay for inhalers. Ellie's cough had started as a winter thing and stayed past the thaw, turning into wheezes that sent us back to the ER twice in 1 month. The new inhaler helped, but the copay didn't. I stood at the pharmacy counter with $40-something in my account and did the math 3 different ways, and none of them made the week stretch. That night, we ate grilled cheese on the floor, our backs against the fridge to catch the warmth, and Ellie colored a sun bigger than the page, while the past due notice curled on the door like it was trying to hide. Pride is a fine coat in good weather, but it does nothing for the cold. It was time to call my father. Gerald answered on the 3rd ring and skipped hello. He had a way of making help sound like a test you'd already failed. He said we could use the spare room for a little while, and I promised it wouldn't be long because I wanted to believe that. The next afternoon, we drove across town to his 2-story place on East Oak, the kind of house with a settling porch and a front door that sticks in the summer, the kind that looks solid from the street. Inside smelled like old coffee and furniture polish, and the spare room had a bowed mattress that barked when I set Ellie's backpack down. Dad rattled off the house routine trash out on Tuesdays, shoes off by the stairs, don't touch the thermostat, and then said not to worry, he'd square up the numbers later. Caleb was already there, stretched out on the couch with a headset and a half-finished soda, offering a lazy wave without looking away from the screen. He's 2 years younger than me and good at making quiet look like effort. Dad called it a rough patch and said I should cut him slack. I set up Ellie's blankets and tucked her stuffed rabbit under the pillow, told her we were camping, and tried not to hear the way the floor creaked like a warning every time I crossed the hall. That first week, I brought home groceries and new filters for the ancient furnace because no one else had, and Dad thanked me in the same tone he used to read a meter. Where we came from, family helped family, but the meaning depended on who said it. Mom used to bake extra when a neighbor was sick and press a foil-covered plate into my hands with a look that said, "This is what we do." Dad used the same words and kept a running tally. I told myself the difference didn't matter as long as Ellie was sleeping through the night, and for a few days the house held steady, me leaving before dawn for the clinic, Ellie fast-walking to meet the school bus, Caleb waking in time for lunch, and Dad drinking coffee at the table, like a foreman surveying a job he no longer had to do. The contrast between the life I knew and the one I'd stepped into sharpened fast. At the clinic, we kept spare socks and granola bars in a drawer for patients who needed them, because small kindnesses go farther than you think. At home, I paid for a new router, because the signal didn't reach the spare room, and Dad said I used the Wi-Fi most anyway. At work, I measured breaths, listened for the tight little whistle that means trouble, and wrote instructions in plain words people could follow. At home, I counted lights left on and cups in the sink and told myself it was temporary. And yet each small expense slid toward me like I was the only spot on the table that wouldn't spill. I carried my mother's values in one hand and a grocery list in the other, and I tried to pretend the weight was the same. Ellie stopped humming on the way up the steps, started clutching her rabbit a little tighter, asked if Grandpa was mad when she forgot to stack her sneakers by the door. I showed her how to line them up heel to heel and kissed the top of her head, said we were guests, and guests do their best, and felt the words settle wrong in my mouth. On the third night, I sat on the edge of the bed while Ellie slept and stared at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map we couldn't read, and I wondered what the bill would be this time. It didn't take long to find out. The numbers Dad promised to square up arrived as little jabs, gas money I'd already paid, a grocery receipt he'd kept, like evidence, a comment about how my room pulled heat. I kept the peace the way nurses do when a patient is angry and scared. At the same time, steady voice, slow breath, step out of the blast zone. But the house had its own rhythm, and I could hear it speeding up, cupboards closing harder, Caleb's laugh getting louder, Dad's pen scratching through a stack of mail at the kitchen table like he was carving something true. That's where part one ends for me, a one-bedroom life packed into a spare room, a little girl trying to be smaller, a father who turned help into a ledger, and a balance that never settled. I didn't know it yet, but the first big line was about to be drawn, and once it was there, would be no mistaking who was keeping score. The change started small enough to miss if you weren't paying attention. A few dollars slipped from my checking account to cover milk, then gas for Dad's truck, then the Wi-Fi router that didn't reach our room. Each charge came with a polite nod and a tone that sounded like gratitude until you realized it was expectation. Every time I paid, I told myself it was fine, that helping out was what family did. But the line between contribution and control thinned fast. Dad had always known how to turn kindness into currency. He'd start a conversation like a ledger review, light, casual, reminding me what I'd used most. The Wi-Fi, the laundry, the heat. Once when the electric bill came in high, he said, "Must be that hairdryer of yours. I'll send you the difference." He never sent it. I paid it anyway, the way I'd been raised to smooth things over before they turned sharp. Caleb hardly left the living room. His gaming headset seemed glued to his head, and the glow from the TV stayed on well past midnight. I'd get home from my shift still in scrubs and find takeout boxes stacked on the coffee table, most of them ordered from my account. The first time I noticed, I thought it was a mistake. When I asked, he shrugged. "Dad said you'd cover it. You're working more than I am." That was true, but the way he said it made my chest tighten. Dad defended him before I could speak. "He's been having a hard time, Morgan. You've got to show compassion. You know how depression works." I nodded because it was easier than arguing, though compassion didn't explain why Caleb could spend hours on gaming forums, but couldn't manage a job application. By the end of the week, my savings had dipped below a number that made me uncomfortable, and I knew better than to ask when it might stop. At the clinic, I tried to hide how tired I was. Between shifts, I'd sit in the break room and stare at the vending machine, wondering if coffee counted as dinner. The other nurses traded weekend plans. I checked my phone for messages from Ellie's school and scrolled past bills I couldn't open yet. When I drove home, I'd park for a minute with the engine running just to collect myself before walking inside. Ellie noticed everything. Kids always do. She stopped singing on the way home from school, stopped asking if she could draw in the living room. One night, while brushing her teeth, she looked up at me in the mirror and asked, "Is Grandpa mad at me?" I told her no, of course not, but my voice caught. She pressed her lips together, nodded once, and went to bed without another word. I sat awake for hours listening to her breathing and trying to believe I hadn't made a mistake coming here. Then came the morning Dad cornered me in the kitchen. Caleb had joined some online mentorship that promised to teach him about cryptocurrency. It cost $900, and the payment had bounced. Dad held the notice like it was my responsibility. "He's trying to better himself," he said. "You're working double shifts. You can afford to help your brother." I told him I was saving for Ellie's new inhalers, that we'd had 2 ER visits this month. His expression hardened. "What's more important, Morgan, your daughter's lungs, or your brother's future?" The room went silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. For a second I thought he was joking. When I realized he wasn't, I felt something in me go still. I didn't argue. I just nodded, walked past him, and closed the door to the spare room. Later I sent the payment from my phone and sat there watching the confirmation screen, wondering when family helps family had turned into a threat. By April, the air in that house carried a constant static small shocks that came from nowhere. Dad left sticky notes on the counter about overdue balances. Caleb borrowed my car without asking. Even Ellie started whispering when she played as if the walls were listening. I told myself we'd get through it, that once I caught up at work, I'd find us another place. But every time I looked at rental listings, the numbers blurred together higher than I could reach. The breaking point came one rainy evening after a long double shift. I had barely stepped inside when I heard voices in the kitchen. Dad was scolding Caleb for something, but when I set my bag down, both of them turned toward me. "Your brother's car insurance is due," Dad said flatly. "He can't keep driving without coverage." Caleb wouldn't meet my eyes. I asked what that had to do with me. Dad sighed as if I were being difficult. "You're living here rent-free. The least you can do is help." Rent-free. The words stung. I paid for utilities, groceries, gas, everything they quietly handed off. But I didn't argue. I just said I'd think about it and went to my room. That night, Ellie drew a picture of a house with 3 people inside and a big red X through the middle. She said it was too noisy. I tucked her in, sat on the edge of her bed, and stared at the drawing long after she fell asleep. A week later, I woke up to find an envelope slid under my door. It wasn't a note, it was a typed letter. Effective immediately, it read, "Rent will increase by $200 a month due to additional strain on household resources." At the bottom, it was signed, House Management G. Hale. I laughed because if I didn't, I'd cry. When I asked him about it, he didn't even look up from his newspaper. "You live under my roof, Morgan. That's how adulthood works." The next day, Caleb knocked on my door. "Hey," he said, eyes down. "Dad said you'd help cover my car insurance this month." I stared at him for a moment before answering. "Your car hasn't moved in weeks," he shrugged. "Still got to keep it running." I watched him walk away and realized how invisible I'd become in my own family. That night, Ellie brushed her teeth beside me and asked, "Why does Grandpa only talk nice when you give him money?" I didn't answer. My throat felt too tight to speak. I turned off the light and kissed her forehead, but something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was the quiet certainty that we couldn't keep living this way. 2 days later, Ruth showed up on the porch holding grocery bags and a soft blue blanket. I hadn't answered her calls in weeks, but when I saw her face, every bit of restraint broke. I told her everything, the slap that never healed right, the bills, the letter, the way Caleb and Dad treated Ellie like a guest in her own home. Ruth didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small brass key. "Your mom gave me this," she said gently, before she passed. "She told me to hold on to it until you really needed it." The key was warm from her hand, small and worn, with a faint engraving near the base, a letter M. I turned it over in my palm, the metal cool against my skin. "What is it for?" I asked. Ruth smiled, sad and steady. She said you'd know when the time came. That night after Ellie fell asleep, I sat on the edge of the bed with the key in my hand. I hadn't thought about Mom's old house in years, the little craftsman on Ash and Hamilton. The last time I saw it was the day we buried her. I'd been too numb to go back since. Now staring at that key, I felt the weight of something I couldn't name. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was memory, but either way, it pulled me toward the next morning. When the first light broke through the blinds, I packed a bag, dropped Ellie at school, and drove toward the address I'd been avoiding for 3 years. The street looked almost the same old maples, cracked sidewalks, the faint smell of rain. The house stood quiet, its porch leaning slightly, wind chimes still hanging by the door. The key fit on the first try. Inside, the air smelled like lemon oil and thyme. The rocking chair still faced the window, and a half-finished quilt lay across its arm as if Mom had just stepped out for tea. On the fridge hung a calendar from the month she died. I moved slowly through the rooms until I reached her bedroom closet. Behind a stack of boxes sat a black filing cabinet, the one she always kept locked. My hands trembled as I turned the key. The drawer slid open with a low groan. Inside were folders labeled in her handwriting, Property East Oak Trust Account Letters to M. Final Instructions. I pulled the one marked Trust Account and unfolded the first document. It was a notarized letter naming me as the sole beneficiary of her father's estate. The second paper was the deed to the house on East Oak Street, the very one I'd been paying to live in. The third was a note written in her soft, looping script, "They will take until you are empty. This house is yours now. Protect Ellie. And never let guilt be the leash that binds you." I sank to the floor, the letter pressed against my chest. The house I'd called Dad's wasn't his at all. It was mine. Mom had known exactly what would happen and left a way out. I stayed there until the sun slanted across the carpet, realizing the truth had been waiting for me all along. Tomorrow I would drive back to East Oak, not as a tenant, not as a daughter begging for mercy, but as the owner of everything they thought they controlled. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. The next morning, I drove back to East Oak Street, the place that had stopped feeling like home long before I learned it was mine. The house looked the same, paint fading near the porch rail curtains drawn tight, but stepping through the door felt different. I moved through the hallway quietly, almost like a guest, while Dad sat at the kitchen table flipping through bills. He didn't look up when I walked in. The air smelled like burnt toast and coffee grounds. "You transfer the utilities yet?" he asked, voice steady, eyes still on the paper. I didn't answer right away. The bandage under my shirt tugged against my ribs, and the dull ache reminded me of every time I'd chosen silence over conflict. He didn't mention the hospital, didn't ask if I was all right, just took another sip and said, "Your room uses the most heat." Ellie's laughter from the hallway was soft, short-lived, like she knew the sound didn't belong here. I followed it to her room and watched her brush her doll's hair beside the window. She smiled when she saw me, then lowered her voice. "Grandpa said we need to be careful with the lights," she whispered. "I'll make sure I turn them off." Her effort to please him twisted something inside me, but I just nodded and told her she was doing great. That night, I sat beside her bed and traced the faint scar on her cheek, the one from the playground fall months ago. I remembered how I had panicked over that small wound, how I'd stayed up watching her breathe. Now my own bruises darkened under my collar, and no one in this house seemed to notice. A few days later, another letter appeared under my door. Same format, same typed lines. It said the rent would increase again $200 more per month due to additional strain on household resources. It was signed the same way House Management G. Hale. I stared at it until the words blurred, then folded it neatly and slipped it into my bag. I didn't cry this time. I didn't even ask what resources meant. There was no point. The man I'd called father was running a business, and I was the only customer. The days turned mechanical. I worked my shifts, came home to quiet resentment, and watched Ellie draw pictures of smiling houses that didn't exist. Every interaction with Dad felt rehearsed. His tone clipped his comments about responsibility or gratitude dropped like tiny traps. Caleb still drifted through the house in hoodies and socks, his cereal bowl glued to one hand, game controller in the other. When I passed by, he'd smirk without looking away from the screen. "Dad said you're getting good overtime," he'd say, like it was a compliment. I'd nod, go to my room and wait for another envelope. Then one evening, while I was rinsing dishes, a soft knock came from the back door. Ruth stood there holding 2 paper bags and that same gentle smile that always felt like relief. "You didn't answer my texts," she said, "so I figured I'd check in." I stepped aside and the smell of her groceries, warm bread and roasted chicken, filled the kitchen, cutting through the bitterness in the air. I hadn't realized how hungry I was until then. We sat at the small table and I told her everything. Every bruise, every bill, every word he'd thrown like a warning. Ruth listened without interrupting, hands folded around a mug of tea she hadn't touched. When I finished, she reached into her purse again. That little brass key sat in her palm, catching the kitchen light. "Your mom wanted you to have this when things got bad," she said softly. "She told me you'd know what to do." I stared at it, feeling the grooves under my thumb. Something in me steadied. The next morning, I packed a small bag, dropped Ellie at school, and drove to Mom's old place on Ash and Hamilton, the house I hadn't visited since her funeral. The neighborhood was quiet, like time had slowed down. The porch still leaned to the left, and the same lavender bushes lined the walk. When I unlocked the door, the smell of lemon oil and old books filled the air, and the silence felt heavy but familiar. I moved from room to room, touching the edges of furniture covered in dust. Mom's rocking chair still sat near the window, her half-finished quilt folded over the arm. It looked like she'd left mid-stitch. On the refrigerator hung a calendar frozen on the month she died. I didn't realize I was crying until I saw the tear drop onto the tile. Her bedroom felt smaller than I remembered. I pulled open drawers one by one until I reached the back of her closet, where a stack of storage bins hid the black filing cabinet I'd seen my whole childhood, the one she always told us to leave alone. The key fit perfectly. Inside were folders labeled in her looping handwriting, Property East Oak Trust Account Letters, to M Final Instructions. I opened the folder marked Trust Account and pulled out a thin stack of papers. My breath caught. The first was a notarized document naming me the sole beneficiary of her father's estate. The second was a deed my name printed clearly at the top, stating that the property at East Oak Street was legally mine. The third was a handwritten note folded so many times it had softened at the edges. Her words ran across the page like a voice I hadn't heard in years. If you're reading this, it means you've endured more than I ever wanted for you. I couldn't protect you from him, but I could leave something behind. They will take until you are empty. This house is yours. Protect Ellie, and never let guilt be the leash that binds you. I sat on the floor, the note trembling in my hands, the reality sinking in. All this time, Dad had been charging me rent on my own home. When I finally stood, the sunlight was fading through the curtains. The house didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt waiting. I locked the filing cabinet again, placed the key in my pocket, and walked outside. The air smelled like rain, and for the first time in months, my shoulders eased. I called Ruth as I sat in the car, my fingers still shaking. She answered on the first ring. "Bring Ellie," she said. "You're not staying there tonight." Her guest room smelled like cinnamon and clean sheets. Ellie ran straight into her godmother's arms and asked if they could make pancakes in the morning. I nodded, unable to speak. That night, I slept without waking, once the sound of steady breathing on either side of me. In the morning, I told Ruth what I planned to do. "I'm filing the paperwork," I said. She studied my face, then nodded. "You sure?" I nodded again. "No more surviving. It's time to take it back." When I walked into the East Oak house that afternoon, Dad was at the kitchen table scribbling notes on a napkin. Caleb sat on the couch, half asleep, cereal bowl balanced on his stomach. Neither looked up. "Where were you?" Dad asked, pen scratching across paper. "At work," I said evenly. "You don't just walk out of someone's house," he muttered. I smiled to myself, unseen. That night after Ellie went to bed, I gathered every record I could find: utility bills, rent transfers, grocery receipts, text messages. I created folders, labeled them carefully, and backed them up on a small flash drive. Ruth helped me run a title search through the county clerk's office. 2 days later, the results confirmed everything. I was the sole title holder of the East Oak property. No mortgage, no cosigner, no shared ownership. Legally and completely, it belonged to me. The weight of that truth was unlike anything I'd felt. I thought about every demand, every envelope, every cruel word disguised as help. He had called me ungrateful while living under my roof. The irony stung, but it also steadied me. I wasn't going to shout or argue. I didn't need to. This wasn't about revenge. It was about finally standing where I was meant to. The next few days passed quietly, almost too quiet. Dad's voice softened, his eyes darting toward me more often, like he could sense something had shifted but didn't know what. Caleb avoided me altogether. At night, I sat beside Ellie's bed, watching her sleep under the soft blue blanket Ruth had brought, and whispered promises I intended to keep. We wouldn't live afraid anymore. I printed the documents, placed them neatly in a folder, and set it beside my purse. There would be paperwork to file, signatures to notarize, and explanations to give, but for once, the path ahead didn't scare me. The storm had already passed. What came next would be mine to choose. Outside, a faint wind moved through the trees, carrying the smell of rain and lilacs from the yard. Ellie stirred in her sleep, clutching her stuffed rabbit. I brushed her hair back and whispered, "We're almost home, baby." The next morning, I would make the call that would change everything. The morning I made the call, the sky was pale gray, the kind that promised rain but never followed through. Ellie was still asleep, curled beneath her quilt, her small hand clutching her rabbit's ear. I sat at the kitchen table, the manila folder spread open in front of me, deed, trust papers, my mother's note. Each page looked like proof of something bigger than luck. When I picked up the phone, my hands didn't shake. The receptionist put me through to Mr. O'Connell, the same attorney who'd settled Mom's affairs years earlier. His voice was exactly as I remembered, steady patient, the kind that didn't rush you even when time mattered. I told him everything. When I finished, there was a pause. "You have every right to file," he said. "We'll handle this properly." By 10 that morning, I was sitting in his office, sunlight bouncing off the glass picture frames on his desk. He reviewed the documents, making quiet notes in the margins, then looked up at me. "We can move on 2 fronts," he said. "Eviction for unlawful occupation and a protective order for the hospital assault." The words protective order hung in the air like something both solid and fragile. I nodded. He slid a pen toward me, and with one signature, everything that had been theory became real. When I left the office, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of exhaust and damp concrete. I walked back to my car, feeling lighter and heavier all at once. There was no triumph in it, just a deep, steady calm. At home that evening, Dad was in the garage working on Caleb's car, cursing under his breath. Caleb was on the porch scrolling through his phone, smoke from his vape clouding the air. Neither looked up as I passed. I closed the door behind me and locked it, not because I needed to, but because I could. For the next few nights, I documented everything. Every text, every note, every receipt. I recorded snippets of conversation when Dad demanded money or complained about ungrateful children. I took photos of the envelopes he slipped under my door. Ruth came by after work to help me sort it all. Her dining table was covered in stacks of paper color-coded folders and printouts. We stayed up late labeling evidence until our eyes burned. "You've got this," she said quietly, sliding a cup of coffee toward me. "You've done everything right." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if she was reassuring me or herself. A week later, the official paperwork came through. The eviction was set for 30 days from the filing date. I marked the calendar, not with a red circle, but with a small, neat X. It was enough. The days in between felt strangely calm. Dad still left notes about expenses or maintenance costs, but the edge in his voice dulled. Maybe he sensed something shifting beneath his feet. Caleb, on the other hand, became bolder. He'd whistle when I walked by, turn up the TV when Ellie was trying to sleep, or leave the door unlocked late at night. Once I caught him in the hallway near my room. "Looking for my headphones," he said, grinning. They were in his hand. I took them back without a word. Each evening, after Ellie was asleep, I checked the files again, making sure every piece of evidence was backed up in 3 places: cloud flash drive and printed copy. The act of organizing felt like rebuilding something I'd lost. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting. I was preparing. Then one night, Ellie tugged at my sleeve while I folded laundry. "Mom," she said softly, "Grandpa told me if I keep leaving lights on, we might not have a place to stay." She looked so small standing there clutching the corner of her blanket. I knelt beside her, brushing her curls back from her face. "This is our home," I said. "No one can take it away from us." She didn't answer, but she leaned into me until her breathing steadied. That moment was when I knew the silence had gone on long enough. After she went to bed, I opened my laptop, turned on the camera, and hit record. I sat at my desk under the yellow light. No makeup, no filters, just my face still healing from bruises that had started to fade. I spoke clearly, one story at a time: the hospital, the slap, the bills, the threats. I added video clips of Caleb bragging on his live stream about how Sis pays for everything. I spliced in voice memos of Dad shouting about rent and responsibility. I named the file For Ellie. I didn't know if I'd ever need it, but I needed to say it out loud, if only once. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of the floorboards under my feet. I stepped outside with a mug of coffee and the folder of documents in my lap. The air was cool and damp, the kind that makes your lungs sting a little when you breathe in too deep. Somewhere down the block, a car engine started, then faded away. For the first time in months, I felt steady enough to look ahead without flinching. At 10:42 that morning, I sat across from Mr. O'Connell again as he finalized the filings. He handed me copies in a labeled envelope, his handwriting small and precise. "You've done everything by the book," he said. "Now let the system do the rest." When I walked out, the wind had shifted. The sun had broken through the clouds. That night, I returned home to find Dad sitting in the living room, arms crossed. Caleb stood behind him, hands in his hoodie pocket. "You need to stop whatever this is," Dad said. "You think we don't notice? The lawyer calls the papers acting like this is your house." His tone was calm, too calm. I met his eyes. "It is my house," I said softly. He laughed short and sharp. "You think a few old papers make you somebody I've paid every bill in this place since your mother left. You've done nothing but take," Caleb added. "Yeah, real nice throwing family out after everything they've done for you." My chest tightened, but my voice didn't shake. "Family doesn't hit their daughter in a hospital bed," I said. The words hung in the air. Dad's face twitched, his jaw tightening. "Don't twist things," he snapped. That was discipline. The argument ended when he stormed out, muttering about betrayal. Caleb followed, slamming the door so hard the window rattled. I stood alone in the hallway, my reflection wavering in the glass. There was no satisfaction in winning that exchange, only a strange quiet, the kind that comes when the truth no longer hides. In the days that followed, the tension simmered into something meaner. Dad stopped speaking to me directly, leaving notes instead. Caleb avoided me entirely, though I could feel him watching. Once I found the thermostat turned up to 80, every light blazing, the washer running empty. They wanted chaos. I gave them calm. I folded each note into the growing file, labeled and dated. Ellie spent those evenings drawing at the kitchen table. One night she held up a picture, 2 stick figures holding hands in front of a small house. Above them was a bright yellow sun. "It's us," she said proudly. "Our home's safe now." I smiled, but something inside me ached with how much she understood without being told. As the eviction date drew closer, the air in the house thickened. The silence wasn't peace anymore, it was a countdown. Each morning, I woke up, crossed off another day on the calendar, and reminded myself that we were moving towards something new, not running away. On the last night of April, I double-checked the folder one more time. Legal documents, video logs, digital backups. Everything was ready. I stood at Ellie's doorway for a long time, watching her sleep beneath the soft glow of her nightlight. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the windows. Tomorrow, I thought, everything changes. I turned off the light, whispered goodnight, and for the first time in years, I felt no fear about what would happen next. The morning after I finalized the filings, the house felt unnaturally still. Even the refrigerator hum seemed cautious. I moved quietly through the kitchen, gathering Ellie's lunchbox and setting it beside her backpack. She was at the table, coloring a picture of the 2 of us standing in front of a house with flowers by the porch. "That's us," she said, smiling softly. "Our home," I nodded, running my hand over her hair. "That's right, sweetheart. Our home." The words settled in the air with more weight than she knew. At work, I went through my shift on autopilot, checking vitals, restocking supplies, answering patient questions, but my mind never left that house. I knew Dad and Caleb had sensed something changing. The air between us had shifted from uneasy to charged like static before a storm. Each sound in that house had meaning. Now the slam of a door, the creak of the hallway, even the scrape of a chair against the floor. They were measuring me, trying to figure out what had altered. That evening, I came home to every light blazing, the thermostat turned up so high it made the air thick. The washer ran empty, spinning nothing but water. Caleb was sprawled on the couch, the TV volume up to drown out thought. I walked past him without a word and turned everything off. Dad appeared in the doorway, coffee cup in hand, expression unreadable. "You seem busy lately," he said. His voice carried that familiar tone, testing, probing for weakness. "Just catching up on things," I replied evenly. Caleb's eyes flicked toward me. "You working less or something?" I didn't answer. I'd stopped explaining myself to people who never listened. The next morning, a folded note was taped to my bedroom door. The handwriting was Dad's neat and deliberate. It read, "Utilities this month were excessive. If you can't cover your share, maybe consider downsizing. You're not the only one with expenses." I took a picture of it, folded it once, and slipped it into my folder. The weight of paper had become familiar, almost comforting, a record of every quiet cruelty. That night, the tension broke its silence. I walked into the living room to find Dad waiting, Caleb behind him, arms crossed. "You need to stop. Whatever you're doing," Dad said. "The lawyer calls the visits acting like this place is yours. You think we don't see it." My voice was steady. "It is mine." He laughed sharp and hollow. "You think a few papers change anything? I've paid every bill here since your mother left. You'd have nothing without me." Caleb's voice joined in mocking. "Yeah, real noble, kicking out your own family. Nice example for your kid." I took a slow breath. Family doesn't hit their daughter in a hospital bed. The room went still. Dad's face twitched. "Don't twist things," he said. That was discipline. His words came quick, defensive. I looked him in the eye. "You split my lip while I was hooked to an IV." His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Then quieter, he tried a different tone. "Don't you care what people will say? That you threw out your sick father?" I didn't reply. I didn't need to. That night I sat at my desk and backed up every file again. The evidence was no longer just insurance. It was truth carved in ink and pixels. Still, something in the house had changed. Their silence wasn't retreat. It was planning. 2 days later, I pulled into the driveway and found our neighbor, Mrs. Lane, waiting by the mailbox. She looked uneasy, twisting her wedding ring around her finger. "Your father told me you're evicting him," she said carefully. "He mentioned he's been diagnosed with COPD and asked for help getting to appointments. Said you refused." The lie hit me harder than I expected. "That's not true," I said quietly. She frowned, pity edging her voice. "I just hope you can work things out." When I walked inside, the performance was already underway. Dad sat in the recliner coughing loudly beside a bottle of cough syrup I recognized from the back of the bathroom cabinet, expired 2 years ago. Caleb hovered near the doorway, eyes lowered but mouth curled into a smirk. I didn't engage. I walked past them to my room, closed the door, and opened my laptop. Later that evening, there was a knock at the door. It was Leah, our neighbor from across the street. She held her phone out, screen glowing. "You need to see this," she said. The video was grainy, the hospital lights harsh. My breath caught as I recognized the scene, my father's raised hand, the slap my body collapsing against the bed, the faint sound of Ellie's screams somewhere down the hall. Leah looked at me, her eyes soft. "I work part-time in that wing. They were supposed to delete the footage after 30 days, but I kept a copy. I thought you might need it." My throat tightened. "Thank you," I whispered. Inside, Ellie was at the kitchen table, coloring quietly. I knelt beside her. "Do you remember the hospital?" I asked. She nodded, eyes still on her drawing. "I heard him yell," she said. "I saw you fall." I gathered her in my arms, holding her so tightly she squirmed. That memory, the one I'd tried to protect her from, had already found its place in her mind. The next morning, the eviction notice was gone from the bulletin board, torn off clean. I printed another copy and placed it on the fridge this time, secured with a bright pink magnet. Caleb stormed into the kitchen when he saw it. "You're sick," he snapped. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're just trying to embarrass us." I met his glare. "No, Caleb. I'm done being invisible." For the rest of the week, Dad doubled down. He called relatives, told them I was heartless, ungrateful, unstable. He even left a voicemail for my supervisor claiming I was neglecting my job. None of it stuck. Truth has its own timing, and mine was coming due. On Thursday night, I stood at the window watching the rain streak down the glass while Ellie slept beside me. The court date was in the morning. My paperwork was in order, my evidence airtight, but my chest still felt heavy. Not from doubt, just from years of being silenced. I pressed my hand against the glass, the cool surface grounding me. Tomorrow I would walk into that courthouse and speak without shaking. When dawn came, it was quiet. I made coffee, packed Ellie's lunch, and slipped the flash drive with the hospital footage into my purse. As I locked the front door, I heard Dad's voice in the living room, low, bitter. "You'll regret this," he said. Maybe he meant it as a warning, but to me it sounded like the end of something that had lasted too long. Ellie tugged at my sleeve, half awake, her rabbit tucked under her arm. "Are we safe now, Mom?" she whispered. I knelt, brushing her hair from her face. "Not yet," I said softly. "But we will be." That night, after filing the final documents and handing over the flash drive to Mr. O'Connell, I returned home to a silence so deep it felt hollow. The house no longer carried echoes. It was just walls. I packed another box, sealing it with tape, the sound cutting through the quiet. 1 week left, 7 days until the eviction became official. I glanced toward Ellie's room where her drawing of our safe house hung crooked on the wall. The little sun above it had rays that stretched too far, spilling past the edge of the paper. I straightened it gently, then turned off the light. Tomorrow, the real test would begin. The week after the court filings, the house felt different, quiet, but not calm. It was the kind of silence that hums beneath the surface, waiting for someone to break it. Dad barely spoke to me now. When he did, it was through clipped notes or muttered remarks left in passing. Caleb pretended not to care, but his silence carried a smug rhythm, like he already knew the ending he wanted. I could sense it the way they watched me, the way the air changed when I entered a room. Each day was a countdown. I'd cross a small mark on the kitchen calendar before heading to work one day closer to freedom. At night, I backed up every file again, photos, texts, video clips, bills, anything that told the story they'd spent years rewriting. Ruth checked in, often dropping off groceries and asking how Ellie was holding up. I told her we were fine, but she could hear the truth between my pauses. One evening, Ellie came to me while I folded laundry. "Mom," she whispered, "Grandpa said if we keep using the heater, we might not have a house anymore." Her voice trembled barely above a breath. I pulled her close, brushed her curls back, and said, "This is our home, sweetheart. Nobody can take it away." She didn't answer, just nodded slowly, and leaned into me until her breathing evened out. When she was asleep, I sat for a long time at the edge of her bed, watching the shadows move across the walls. That was when I realized the fear in her eyes had replaced the fear in mine. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The house was still the kind of quiet that feels both safe and fragile. I made coffee, sat on the porch, and watched the fog roll down the street. I had less than a week left until the eviction date. The thought should have scared me, but it didn't. It steadied me. I knew what had to come next. That evening, as I came home from work, I found the thermostat cranked up again and the washer running with nothing inside. Caleb was asleep on the couch TV, blaring the front door wide open. I turned everything off, locked the door, and walked to my room without a word. When I came out an hour later, a note was taped to my door. It read, "Utilities this month were excessive. If you can't cover your share, maybe consider downsizing." I folded it carefully, slid it into my folder, and went back to Ellie's room. She was sitting on the floor, coloring a picture of a small house under a bright sun. In crayon, she'd written, "Our home is safe." 2 nights later, the confrontation came. I had just finished tucking Ellie into bed when I heard voices in the living room. Dad's tone was sharp, low enough to sound controlled, but high enough to carry. "You need to stop this nonsense," he said. I stepped into the doorway. He didn't wait for me to speak. "You think we don't know what you're doing? That lawyer of yours, the court dates you're making a fool of this family." Caleb stood behind him, arms crossed, avoiding my eyes. I took a slow breath. "This isn't your house, Dad." His laugh was quick, brittle. "You think a few papers make you somebody I built this place? I've paid every bill since the day your mother left." His words came faster now, brittle at the edges. "You've done nothing but take." Caleb spoke next. "You're really throwing out your own family. Real nice lesson for your kid." My voice stayed calm. Family doesn't hit their daughter in a hospital bed. The room fell silent. Dad's jaw tightened, the vein in his neck visible even in the dim light. "Don't twist things," he said. "That was discipline. You were being disrespectful." I met his eyes. "You split my lip while I was hooked to an IV." His expression shifted, first denial, then something smaller, something almost afraid. "You'll regret this," he said. "You'll see what people say about you." He turned away before I could answer, muttering about betrayal. Caleb followed him, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the picture frames. After they left the room, I sank into the nearest chair. The air smelled like coffee grounds and burnt dust from the heater. Somewhere down the hallway, the fridge hummed on and off, steady as a heartbeat. I looked at the calendar, 3 days left. The next morning, I found a new game waiting for me. Every cabinet door in the kitchen hung open. The thermostat was set to 90. A stack of dirty dishes was left in the sink with a note. "If you're too busy to clean, maybe you should move." I didn't react. I took a photo of everything one by one and saved it. Calm was my weapon now. Later that day, Ruth stopped by with folders of paperwork. "We'll make sure everything's airtight," she said. We spent hours reviewing evidence, matching timestamps, and double-checking each file. By the time she left, the sun had dipped below the trees. The house was dark except for the kitchen light. Ellie had fallen asleep on the couch, her rabbit tucked under her chin. I sat beside her, watching the rise and fall of her chest, thinking of my mother's letter, "They will take until you are empty." The next day, I came home to find our neighbor Leah waiting by the porch, a brown envelope in her hands. "Thought you'd want this," she said. Inside were printed stills from the hospital footage, the slap, the fall, the nurse rushing in. "They can't deny it now," she said quietly. I thanked her and slipped the envelope into my bag. Inside, Dad's voice echoed faintly from the living room. "You think you can win this," he said. "You'll ruin yourself before you ruin me." I didn't answer. I just walked to my room and locked the door. That night, I made another video. This one wasn't for court. It was for safety. I looked into the camera and told the story from start to finish. No editing, no breaks. I showed the documents, the letters, the hospital footage. I saved 3 copies, one on the cloud, one on Ruth's computer, and one on a flash drive I kept on my keychain. No matter what happened next, the truth would survive. The days leading to the eviction blurred together. Dad stopped talking altogether. Caleb moved through the house with the smug calm of someone who thought he'd already won. I stayed quiet, patient. Every morning, Ellie and I marked off another day on the calendar with a small X. Each mark felt like a step closer to breathing freely again. On the night before the deadline, I woke to the sound of voices outside my window. I pulled back the curtain just enough to see Dad and Caleb in the driveway talking to someone on the phone. Their faces were tight pale. I didn't know what they were planning, but I knew it didn't matter. The law was already in motion. The next morning, the air was heavy, thick with the weight of what was about to happen. I dressed quietly, packed Ellie's school bag, and double-checked the folder one last time. Every document was where it needed to be. At 9 o'clock sharp, a car pulled into the driveway. The deputy stepped out, clipboard in hand, badge, catching the morning light. From the kitchen, I heard Dad's voice rise. "You think you can do this to us?" he shouted. "After everything we've done for you," Caleb stood behind him, eyes darting between the deputy and me. The street had already begun to fill with curious faces behind half-open curtains. The deputy's tone stayed calm. "Mr. Hale, this is a lawful eviction. You've had your notice." Dad's hands trembled as he pointed toward me. "She's throwing her sick father into the street," he yelled. But the words no longer carried weight, not against the stack of papers in the deputy's hand, not against the truth I'd built piece by piece. I met his eyes and said nothing. Behind me, Ellie's voice broke the silence. "Mom," she whispered. I turned, kneeling beside her. "It's all right," I said softly. "It's just time for something new." When I stood again, Dad's face had gone pale. He looked around the room as if searching for an exit that wasn't there. Caleb muttered under his breath, but even he sounded unsure now. The deputy stepped forward, clear and professional. "Per court authority," he said, "possession of this property transfers today." I nodded once. Dad's shoulders dropped. The fight was over, but the moment hung in the air like a storm about to break. Ellie clutched my hand, her small fingers warm against mine. Outside, the morning sun broke through the clouds, flooding the porch with light. And though the day was far from over, I knew the tide had finally turned. The next step, the one where truth would speak louder than blood, was waiting just beyond that door. The deputy's car sat at the curb, lights flashing faintly against the gray morning. I stood on the porch beside Ellie, her hand small and warm in mine. Dad was already at the doorway, pacing like a man cornered in his own shadow. "You really think you can do this?" he shouted. "You're throwing your own father into the street." His voice cracked on the last word, but I didn't respond. The deputy stepped forward, clipboard in hand, calm and professional. "Mr. Hale, this is a lawful eviction. You've had 30 days' notice." Caleb stood behind him, still in the same hoodie he'd worn for days, a bowl of cereal clutched in one hand, like none of it was real. The neighbors had begun to gather quietly along the sidewalks, faces behind curtains, phones half raised. Mrs. Lane leaned on her porch railing, eyes sharp but sympathetic. I could feel the weight of every gaze, but none of it mattered now. Dad's tone shifted. "After everything I've done for you," he said, turning toward the small crowd, This is how she repays me, kicking out her sick father." He coughed twice for effect, more than need. "She's ungrateful. Cold." The deputy kept his distance but didn't move away. "Sir, please step back," he said. "We're here to ensure a peaceful transition." I opened my folder and handed over the sealed envelope Mr. O'Connell had prepared. Inside were the trust documents, the deed, and copies of the eviction order. The deputy reviewed them, nodding slowly. "Everything's in order." He looked up at me. "Ma'am, you can proceed." Dad lunged forward, finger pointed. "You can't possibly believe this nonsense. She's lying. This is my home." I reached into my bag and held up a small flash drive. "There's more," I said quietly. He froze. I handed it to the deputy, who plugged it into his tablet. Within seconds, the sound filled the air. The unmistakable voice of my father in that hospital room. The slap, the fall, the nurse shouting in the background. Ellie's faint cry echoed from the recording. The deputy's expression didn't change, but his voice did. "That's enough," he said firmly. "Mr. Hale, you need to gather your belongings and leave the property now." The silence that followed felt like a door closing. Dad's shoulders sagged, his bluster deflating. Caleb muttered something under his breath, but even he didn't move. Mrs. Lane stepped down from her porch, arms crossed. "You should be ashamed," she said quietly. The crowd murmured. Dad's eyes darted toward them, searching for sympathy he wouldn't find. He turned back to me, his voice raw. "You'll regret this," he said. "You think this is justice? This is revenge." I met his eyes and shook my head. "No, it's freedom." He looked around once more, as if waiting for someone to come to his defense. When no one did, he picked up his worn jacket from the hook by the door and walked past me without a word. Caleb followed, carrying a duffel bag that hung half-zipped, his face pale and blank. They reached the bottom of the steps, paused for a moment, then kept walking until they disappeared down the street. For a long time, the only sound was the faint hum of the deputy's car engine. Then, as if on cue, Ellie tugged at my hand. "Mom?" she whispered. "Are we safe now?" Her voice was small, careful, like she didn't quite believe it yet. I knelt beside her and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "Yes, baby," I said. "We're safe." The deputy handed me a signed form confirming the property transfer. "It's official," he said. "They can't come back without a court order." I thanked him, and when his car pulled away, the quiet that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was full, like air returning to a room after years of holding your breath. Mrs. Lane lingered at the edge of the yard. "You did what you had to," she said softly. "Don't let anyone make you feel wrong for that." I nodded. She hesitated, then added, "That little girl of yours, she's stronger than most grown folks I know." Ellie squeezed my hand tighter, and we walked back into the house together. The living room looked smaller somehow, stripped of the weight it had carried. I opened the windows and let the morning light spill in. The air smelled faintly of dust and coffee, but beneath it was something new, clean, open, alive. Over the next few days, I moved quietly through the rooms, sorting what to keep and what to let go. I packed boxes, labeled them neatly, and carried each one to the car. Some neighbors stopped by to help, others just waved from a distance. No one mentioned Dad or Caleb. It was as if the house itself was ready to forget. One evening, I found Ellie sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, drawing in her notebook. She looked up and smiled. "I made a picture," she said, holding it up. Two figures stood in front of a house, hand in hand, with a big yellow sun overhead. "That's us," she explained. I studied the drawing for a moment, tracing the lines with my thumb. "It's beautiful," I said. "Just like you." That night, I made pancakes for dinner, the first meal I'd cooked in that kitchen, without feeling watched. Ellie helped stir the batter, spilling flour on the counter, and laughing when it puffed into the air. We ate together at the table. No background noise, no sharp voices. Just the sound of forks scraping plates and the soft hum of the refrigerator. Later, after she fell asleep, I walked through each room one last time. The walls held faint outlines where pictures used to hang. The marks didn't feel sad. They felt honest. I cleaned the counters, folded the last blanket, and set the keys on the table. Tomorrow, the house would belong to someone new. When the sun came up, the moving truck was already in the driveway. Ruth arrived with coffee and a smile. "You ready?" she asked. I looked around the empty living room, the echo of Ellie's laughter still hanging in the air. "Yeah," I said quietly. "More than ready." As we loaded the last box, Mrs. Lane crossed the street with a small bouquet of wildflowers from her garden. "For your new place," she said, handing them to me. "Something to start fresh." I thanked her and she squeezed my hand before turning back toward her porch. When the truck pulled away, Ellie waved through the window. The house on East Oak grew smaller in the rear-view mirror until it disappeared behind the trees. For a moment, I thought I'd feel regret, but all I felt was calm, the kind that comes after a storm finally breaks. Our new home was a small cottage across town, 2 bedrooms with a slanted roof and a yard full of lavender. The paint on the shutters was chipped the porch uneven, but it felt right the moment we stepped inside. Ellie ran from room to room laughing as sunlight poured through the east-facing windows. "Can we paint my room blue?" she asked. I smiled. "Any color you want." That evening we unpacked just enough to make the place feel lived in a few framed photos, Ellie's stuffed rabbit, the quilt Ruth had given me months ago. The rest could wait. When night came, I tucked Ellie into her new bed, kissed her forehead and turned off the light. She whispered, half asleep, "I like it here, Mom." I sat beside her for a long while, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing. Through the open window, I could hear the faint rustle of lavender in the yard and the distant sound of crickets. For the first time in years, there was no tension under my skin, no waiting for the next outburst. Just peace. Outside, the moonlight fell across the empty boxes stacked by the door, each one a quiet reminder that leaving isn't always loss. It's sometimes the beginning of finally coming home. The first few mornings in the new cottage felt unreal, as if my body hadn't caught up to the quiet. I'd wake before sunrise expecting the sound of footsteps in the hallway or doors slamming in anger, but all I heard was the soft hum of the refrigerator and the wind brushing against the lavender outside. Ellie would sleep soundly in the next room, her breathing steady, her dreams untroubled. The house held no weight, no ghosts, just the smell of coffee soap and something new taking root. Ruth stopped by often bringing muffins or helping unpack the last of the boxes. She'd joke about how I still labeled everything like we were moving cross-country. But sometimes she'd pause mid-laugh and just look at me, really look and say, "You seem lighter." And she was right. It wasn't joy, not yet. It was peace, something quieter and stronger than happiness. The days began to find their rhythm. I worked my shifts at the clinic, came home before sunset, and cooked simple dinners while Ellie colored at the table. We planted a few flowers in the front yard, just enough to bring color to the space. On weekends, we'd sit on the porch sipping lemonade while she brushed her stuffed rabbit's ears with a tiny comb. The world no longer felt dangerous or unpredictable. It simply felt ours. One afternoon, while sorting through a box I hadn't touched since moving, I found my mother's letter again, the one she'd left tucked inside the old filing cabinet. The paper had softened at the edges, but her handwriting was still clear and sure. "They will take until you are empty. Use what's yours. Protect your daughter. Never let guilt be the leash that binds you." I read those words slowly, feeling each one settle into the space that used to ache. She hadn't just left me a house. She'd left me a way back to myself. That evening I sat at the kitchen table and wrote my own letter, this one for Ellie. I didn't fill it with advice or warnings. I just told her about love, the kind that lifts instead of weighs down, the kind that doesn't ask for repayment. I told her that she never had to earn peace the way I did, that it was hers from the start. I folded it neatly, sealed it, and tucked it into a drawer she'd one day open when she was ready. Weeks passed before I heard anything about my father or Caleb. A cousin mentioned they'd moved 2 towns over, renting a small apartment above a garage. I didn't ask for details. For the first time, I didn't need to know. Forgiveness wasn't something I owed them. It was something I offered myself. Letting go didn't erase what happened. It simply made room for something better. By late spring, the cottage had started to feel like home. Ellie's room was painted pale blue, just like she wanted. Her drawings filled the walls, crayon suns, smiling stick figures, and one that showed the 2 of us standing beside a house with lavender in the yard. She'd written underneath in her uneven letters, "We're safe now." I framed it and hung it by the door. Sometimes, when the evening light slanted through the kitchen window, I'd catch myself humming while washing dishes. It wasn't the song that mattered. It was the fact that I could sing again without fear. Ruth noticed it too. "You finally sound like yourself," she said one night as we sat on the porch. I smiled watching Ellie chase fireflies across the yard. Maybe for the first time I answered, not long after I started therapy at Ruth's suggestion. It wasn't easy revisiting the pieces I'd buried, but it helped me understand how much silence had cost me. Healing wasn't about pretending it never happened. It was about learning that I could live beyond it. Each session felt like peeling back another layer of something that had kept me small. The cottage began to fill with laughter, little rituals, and the kind of normal days I once thought were impossible. Ellie would wake early to watch the sunrise, and we'd eat breakfast on the porch, her legs swinging from the chair too big for her feet. She'd ask questions about school, about my work, about her grandmother, and I'd answer all of them honestly. We didn't hide from our past anymore. We honored what it taught us. One Sunday afternoon, she looked up from brushing her rabbit's fur and asked Mom, "Do you think Grandma's proud of us?" I paused, the sunlight catching her curls. "I think she always was," I said, "but I think she'd be even prouder now." Ellie smiled, tucking the rabbit into her lap. "I think so too." We sat together quietly, listening to the breeze carry the scent of lavender through the air. That night, after she'd gone to bed, I stepped outside one last time. The stars were out, the air cool and still. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who whispered instead of spoke, who mistook fear for love. And I realized she wasn't gone. She'd just changed shape, like glass melted down and remade into something stronger. As I turned off the porch light and closed the door, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: ease. Not victory, not defiance, just a calm certainty that we were finally free. If you've ever had to rebuild yourself from the ground up, I hope you remember this: strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet choice to keep going, to make peace where there used to be pain, to love yourself enough to walk away. Thank you for listening to my story. If it reminded you of your own journey, share it in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if you believe in stories that remind us we can rise again, stay with us. There's more to come.